Hello, my friends. Vladimir Putin did something very characteristic before his state visit to India. He sat down with Indian media and laid out calmly and methodically how Moscow sees the conflict in Ukraine and the broader confrontation with the West. That alone already tells you something important. Russia is not acting like a country that feels cornered or ashamed. It is speaking to a major power like India as an equal, explaining its position, and signaling to the rest of the world that the Western narrative about this war is fundamentally dishonest. Let's start with the core claim Putin made. Russia did not start the war in Ukraine. According to Moscow, what started this entire chain of events was not some sudden Russian aggression, but a Western-sponsored regime change operation in Kiev. The 2014 Maidan upheaval wasn't a spontaneous uprising of pure Democrats. It was a coup in which the West supported, facilitated, and organized the overthrow of a sitting government. After that, everything else followed. The upheaval in Crimea, the rebellion in Donbass, and ultimately the open war we see today. Crimea is the first critical piece. Western propaganda has hammered the phrase Russian annexation into the public mind, but that framing deliberately hides something essential. Moscow's position is that Crimea did not start this crisis, Crimea reacted to it. Once the constitutional order in Kiev was broken by force, a part of the country that was overwhelmingly Russian in identity and Russian-speaking in daily life chose not to accept the new nationalist authorities. The people there held a referendum and voted to join the Russian Federation. Now, the West likes to pretend that the little green men who appeared in Crimea, armed men without insignia, proved that this was all some illegal Russian military takeover. Putin's defenders flip that argument on its head. They say, if we want to be legalistic, Western governments never admit who paid the Maidan snipers, who financed the protests, who was pulling the strings. They act as if none of that is provable. Fine, then apply the same logic. We can also say it is not formally proven whose soldiers those little green men were. What is clear is that they created the conditions for Crimeans to vote without chaos, without bloodshed, without civil war. They did not force people at gunpoint to vote to join Russia. They ensured that a population which no longer recognized Kiev as legitimate could exercise self-determination in peace. And here is the key legal and moral point. When a central government comes to power through a coup, parts of the country have a right to determine their own future. You can walk through the UN Charter and all the caveats about territorial integrity and self-determination. But at a broad level, the principle is clear. If the constitutional order is broken by force in the capital, regions that reject that coup can choose a different path. Crimea did exactly that. From Moscow's perspective, it followed international law more faithfully than the people who toppled the government in Kiev. After Crimea, attention shifted to the southeast of Ukraine, Donbass. For 8 long years, Russia tried, at least on paper, to handle the Donbass question by peaceful means. The Minsk agreements were supposed to be the mechanism: autonomy for Donetsk and Lugansk within Ukraine, constitutional changes, special status, and a political solution instead of a military one. Moscow agreed, Donbass leaders agreed, Kiev put its signature on the documents, and European leaders acted as guarantors. Then, years later, those same Western leaders openly confessed that they never meant to implement Minsk. Merkel, Hollande, Poroshenko, and others admitted publicly that Minsk was a way to buy time to arm Ukraine, train its forces, and prepare it for a future confrontation with Russia. In other words, they used a peace agreement as a cover for war preparations. From a Russian or skeptical Western analyst's perspective, this is extraordinary. You don't have to speculate or spread conspiracy theories. You just have to quote what these leaders themselves said. They incriminated themselves. They admitted that what Moscow had been warning about for years was true. The West was not seeking peace, it was seeking advantage. And they were so arrogant, so sure of their own impunity, that they bragged about it afterward. That raises a simple question. Why would they confess? Did they think they were so far above moral judgment that it didn't matter? Were they trying to ease their own conscience to say, yes, we deceived and escalated, but at least we're honest about it now? Whatever the motive, the effect is the same. They validated the Russian narrative. The arguments that pro-Russian analysts make today are built, in part, on the words of Western politicians and former officials. They handed Rus, this pattern doesn't just exist in Ukraine, over and over again. Former intelligence officers, ex-officials, and retired agents in the West eventually talk. They admit covert actions, coup attempts, psychological operations, and destabilization campaigns from Latin America to the Middle East and beyond. After the damage is done, after people have died, they write memoirs or give interviews that confirm what was once dismissed as Russian propaganda. The Ukrainian case is simply the most recent and most blatant version of this pattern. Against that background, Putin's current stated aim in Ukraine is straightforward: protect Russian interests and protect the people living in the new regions, Donbass, and what he calls Novorossiya. When he uses the term Novorossiya, he's not talking about some vague imperial nostalgia. He's referring to a well-defined band of historically Russian lands running from Donbass along the Black Sea coast all the way toward Transnistria in Moldova, places like Mariupol, Melitopol, Kherson, Nikolaev, maybe even Odessa if it comes to that. Putin has repeatedly hinted that if Kiev continues attacking Russian infrastructure and shipping, especially in the Black Sea, Ukraine may lose its access to the sea. In plain language, Russia may complete the liberation or capture of the entire coastal strip, leaving what's left of Ukraine landlocked. That is not a secret. It's been telegraphed openly enough that no one in Kiev or Brussels can claim surprise. The message from Moscow is, we will protect these regions and these people, and if you keep escalating, the map will change even more in our favor. Now look at the Kiev regime itself. From the Russian standpoint, you have a leadership whose legal mandate has expired, a president who no longer has democratic legitimacy, and a state that has driven itself into a demographic and economic catastrophe. Millions have left the country. Large swaths of land and infrastructure are being sold off or pledged to foreign interests for pennies on the dollar. Entire neighborhoods and assets are being snapped up by outside capital, while ordinary Ukrainians pay the price in blood. This leadership is trapped in a dead end. Putin himself said it. The authorities in Kiev have driven themselves into a cul-de-sac. There is no room for real maneuver. On the battlefield, there is no way to reverse the strategic balance. Economically, Ukraine survives only on Western funding that is increasingly difficult to justify to frustrated taxpayers in Europe and the United States. The only initiative left to Kiev is to cheer on the confiscation of Russian assets in the West funds. Moscow will eventually recover in kind through seizures of Western property or territory under Russian control. So what is the point of continuing? Every extra month of war does not bring Ukraine closer to victory. It brings it closer to exhaustion and partition. That's the harsh, cold reality. Analysts like me can at least say this. We warned from the beginning that this path was suicidal. We argued that there were reasonable terms on the table early on, and that rejecting them would lead to exactly what we're seeing now. Let's recall what Russia actually demanded. Moscow did not ask for regime change in Kiev. It did not insist on carving up Ukraine from day one. In 2022, during the Istanbul talks, the Russian side was prepared to put the most contentious issues, like the final status of Donbass, aside. The key demand was simple and, from any great power perspective, logical. Ukraine must not join NATO. No foreign military alliance, no hostile bases, no missile systems parked in historically Russian regions right on Russia's border. This is not some bizarre, unique Russian neurosis. Ask yourself how Washington would react if Mexico joined a military bloc with Russia and China and started hosting joint bases along the Texas border. If Beijing and Moscow started staging military exercises in Baja California and Sonora, would the United States shrug and say, well, Mexico is a sovereign country, it can do what it likes? Of course not. We all know that. There are basic unwritten rules in geopolitics. You do not ring a major nuclear power with hostile alliances and then act offended when it pushes back. But that is exactly what NATO tried to do with Russia in Ukraine. Moscow was told in the 1000 990 seconds that NATO would not expand eastward, and then watched the alliance move closer and closer, wave after wave. When Russia finally drew a clear red line over Ukraine, over territory that is historically Russian, heavily Russian-speaking, and strategically vital for access to the Black Sea, its warnings were ignored. And when Moscow responded, NATO pretended to be shocked. Even Ukrainian officials have admitted how reasonable some of Russia's early positions were. David Arakhamia, leader of Zelensky's own party faction, has publicly confirmed that during the Istanbul talks in 2022, the Russian proposals were not extreme, not maximalist. They could have formed the basis for a settlement, but Western powers told Kiev not to accept them, not to sign. So whose fault is it that the war dragged on? Who bears responsibility for the extra deaths, the additional destruction, the further loss of territory? From Moscow's viewpoint, Russia has consistently tried to exit the conflict on reasonable terms and has been blocked at every turn by the West. That's why there is such bitterness toward certain Russian figures who defected to the Western narrative at critical moments. They are seen as people who betrayed their own country precisely when Russia was being demonized and attacked despite having given its adversaries every opportunity for a negotiated outcome. All of this sits inside a larger strategic picture. Russia as a central pillar of the emerging multipolar world. China may be the economic engine, but Russia is the backbone in two crucial domains: energy and hard power. Countries like India, Iran, and others do not simply deal with Russia out of sentiment. They rely on Russian oil, gas, advanced air defense systems, fighter jets, tanks, and military technologies. India, for example, produces the T-90 tank, one of the best tanks in the world under license from Russia, and operates Russian-designed aircraft. When India has had problems in recent conflicts, it was often Western equipment that underperformed, not the Russian systems. Meanwhile, Europe has been busy sabotaging itself. Germany, once the industrial powerhouse of the continent, destroyed its own competitive advantage by cutting itself off from affordable Russian energy. Without that foundation, German industry is losing ground. Italy's economy increasingly leans on luxury goods whose underlying manufacturing often depends on Asian production chains, especially Chinese. Compare that to Russia, which sells things that are strategic and indispensable: energy, raw materials, critical military technologies. Those are the goods that decide whether a state remains sovereign or becomes dependent. That same strategic lens also applies to the information domain. Putin has warned that platforms like Telegram and other social networks are being used for psychological and information warfare, especially targeting young people. Here again, there is a balance to strike. Serious analysts are not calling for the elimination of free debate or genuine dissent. Open discussion is healthy and necessary in any society. But it's naive to pretend that major Western governments and their intelligence services don't weaponize media and social networks to destabilize adversaries. We've seen this movie before, from color revolutions to information campaigns that soften up a target before sanctions, coups, or even open war. So Russia's argument is simple. It needs to defend its information space just as it defends its territorial borders. That means distinguishing between individual citizens expressing critical opinions and orchestrated foreign campaigns that aim to fracture a society in the run-up to a political or military confrontation. The West is not going to voluntarily restrain its own information warfare tools. Therefore, countries like Russia have to build legal and technical defenses of their own. When you put all of this together, the Russian narrative becomes brutally clear. Since at least 2014, and in many ways since much earlier, Moscow has been consistent. It warned that NATO expansion toward Ukraine was unacceptable. It backed a negotiated framework in Minsk and watched the West treat that framework as a smokescreen. It came to the table again in Istanbul and saw its proposals vetoed, not by Kiev, but by Western capitals. In parallel, it watched Western leaders brag about using peace deals to arm Ukraine and listened to them lecture the world about international law and territorial integrity while ignoring both whenever it suited them. The result is the war we see today, a war that, from Russia's standpoint, is not a war of choice, but a war forced upon it by Western duplicity and strategic blindness. The tragedy is that it didn't have to be this way. The West could have accepted a neutral Ukraine, could have acknowledged Russia's red lines, could have honored its own promises not to expand NATO. Instead, it chose escalation wrapped in hypocrisy. That's why so many outside the Western Bloc, India, large parts of the global South, much of the non-aligned world refuse to parrot Washington's talking points. They see what Russia is saying not as wild propaganda, but as a plausible account backed by confessions from Western leaders themselves. They understand that today it is Russia being encircled and demonized. Tomorrow, it may be them. In that sense, Putin's words to Indian media weren't just an interview. They were a message to the global majority. Russia will defend its interests and its people in Donbass and Novorossiya. It will not allow NATO to park a hostile military machine on its historic doorstep, and it will continue to expose the gap between the West's rhetoric and its behavior. The longer the West refuses to face these realities, the more Ukraine will suffer, and the more the eventual settlement will reflect Russia's terms, not Washington's illusions. Let's strip away the theatrical noise, the influencer posturing, and the fever dream narratives that get pushed online, and focus on what actually matters: operational reality, battlefield geometry, political incentives, and the structural shape of any settlement that could plausibly end the Russia-Ukraine war without simply resetting the clock for the next one. Start with the maritime strike. Everyone got excited about the submarine incident and the impressive explosion that social media instantly converted into a victory parade. The first thing any serious analyst does is wait for imagery and confirm what hit what. When the satellite imagery arrives, you can see why the initial celebration was premature. The main blast appears to have struck the pier, a concrete structure that absorbed the bulk of the explosion rather than delivering a direct hit to the submarine's hull. That distinction is not cosmetic. A direct strike on the pressure hull would have been catastrophic. Striking the pier is a very different outcome. Even if there may still be shockwave effects, potential propulsion or propeller damage, and the kind of secondary impacts you can't fully assess from a single angle. Now, look at the second submarine visible in older reference imagery. People ask why it wasn't targeted. Because it's positioned differently inside protected pens, and penetrating those hardened pens is an entirely different problem set. Getting into the pen is the hard part. And if the attacker did not actually breach it, then the strike we're discussing is not a decisive demonstration of capability so much as a warning shot that happened to land imperfectly. But step back further. Even if the Ukrainians had sunk one or even two high-value naval assets, you still have to ask the cold, unpleasant question, what does the resource allocation accomplish relative to the front line? Sea drones and subsurface attacks are flashy. They generate headlines. They embarrass the Black Sea Fleet, which has taken real reputational damage. But wars are not won on reputational damage alone. They're won on manpower, artillery, logistics, air defense, drone integration, manufacturing throughput, and the grind of positional advantage. If Ukraine pours scarce resources into strategic-style strikes, the trade-off is unavoidable. Fewer resources for the brutal, frontline realities that decide who controls territory. Meanwhile, Russia is forced to reallocate resources to protect ports and pens, more barriers, more sensors, more patrol patterns, more layered defenses, which may reduce the success rate of follow-on attacks. That's how warfare adapts. A lucky failure today can be the reason tomorrow's strike runs into a hardened defense architecture. And yes, it remains unclear how many maritime drones were involved, whether barriers were bypassed opportunistically, for example, slipping through as a vessel enters or exits, or whether a multi-drone sequence was used where one detonates to open a path. But the larger point remains, the existence of a weapon is not the same thing as scalable production of that weapon. Ukraine's chronic constraint in long-range and exotic systems has been scalability. Testing is not mass fielding. Now, While people are obsessing over one pier and one explosion, dangerous misinformation spreads in parallel, the kind that is not just wrong, but escalatory. Claims circulating online that Russia has deployed 360,000 troops to Belarus directly along the NATO border and will by Christmas likely launch an attack into NATO are not analysis. They are panic merchandising. They are stitched together from unreliable fragments and framed as likely, implying A is greater than 50% probability. That's reckless. And it's also internally contradictory with the other narrative these same circles push. Russia is collapsing. Russia is getting smashed. Russia can't do anything yet. Somehow Russia also has hundreds of thousands poised to invade NATO imminently. Which is it? You can't inhabit both realities at once. What you're seeing is not coherent assessment. It's emotional programming. So put the hysteria aside and return to the map, because the map is where ideology goes to die. The territorial situation shows continued Russian control expanding in key areas. Seversk, long treated by some commentators as a propaganda football, is now effectively acknowledged as mostly under Russian control, with remaining pockets shifting through gray zone exploitation and consolidation. This is not a single-day miracle, it's the cumulative result of weeks of grind, with some mapping outlets updating in bursts rather than incrementally. The plausible reason for delayed updates is simple. Some mappers prefer not to lock in gains until the risk of immediate Ukrainian counteraction fades, or until they have enough geolocated confirmation. That's why you sometimes see a large batch appear at once after days of apparent stagnation. Move south and you see the same pattern. Incremental Russian advances, building a base of control, pushing out from previously contested nodes, tightening defensive depth, and making later Ukrainian counterpunches more expensive. In sectors like the Guliopol area, which has unique defensive and offensive difficulties due to terrain and fortification patterns, these shifts matter even when they look small on a zoomed-out map. Move again, and you see pockets under pressure where the narrative machine simply refuses to look. When the public conversation is fixated on one city, another sector can be sliding into catastrophe and silence. There are areas where Ukrainian defenders have held for long periods, and when the situation deteriorates, it is psychologically and politically inconvenient to admit it. If it doesn't serve the story, it gets ignored. That isn't compassion, it's cynicism. Real people bleed while commentators curate timelines. And that brings us to the core question that actually matters, the settlement structure. Not the 5-point, 10-point, 20-point, 24-point, 28-point theater, but an arrangement that reflects battlefield realities and addresses the two security problems that keep the war alive. Kiev's fear of future Russian aggression and Moscow's fear of Ukraine being integrated militarily into a hostile alliance architecture. The most serious workable framework I've seen recently is an armed non-alignment model. Not ideal, not fair, but implementable. The premise is blunt. The pre-war status quo is unacceptable to both combatants. Moscow has consistently demanded territorial concessions and permanent neutrality, meaning no NATO membership. Ukraine, for its part, cannot accept a settlement that leaves it demilitarized and without credible means of self-defense. So the question becomes, can you design a Ukrainian force posture that is strong enough to deter and deny, but not structured as an offensive springboard that threatens Russia? Armed non-alignment tries to do exactly that. It excludes formal membership in alliances like NATO, bars foreign basing, and constrains certain categories of cooperation, but it does not turn Ukraine into a helpless, neutral. Instead, it builds Ukraine into a porcupine, difficult and bloody to seize, capable of imposing severe attritional cost, but not configured to march deep into Russia or reconquer occupied territory through large-scale offensive thrusts. The logic is not utopian, it is engineering. A peace that lasts must make both sides believe the outcome is safer than restarting the war. If Either side sees the settlement as merely a pause while the other rearms for the next round. You don't have peace, you have an intermission. Now, there are political landmines. Europe has tied years of rhetoric, legitimacy, and ideological identity to the promise of NATO's irreversible path for Ukraine. Backing away becomes an admission of failure, not just strategic failure, but moral and institutional failure. And that kind of ego-driven credibility politics is often more stubborn than battlefield math. This is why even workable plans can get torpedoed. Not because they don't function, but because they force elites to confess they sold a fantasy. There's also the bitter historical sting. Something resembling this could likely have been achieved early, before the slaughter metastasized. Instead, after years of war, you arrive at an outcome that may be similar or worse than what was on the table in the opening phase, except now you've added hundreds of thousands dead, millions displaced, and a demographic wound that will shape Ukraine for generations. That reality will be politically radioactive in Kiev. It will also land like poison across European capitals that spent years promising victory-grade end states. And yes, demographic constraints are not a footnote, they are the foundation. The ability to sustain a large standing military in peacetime, while also rebuilding the economy and keeping manufacturing alive, is a hard limit. A settlement model that assumes an endlessly recruitable, endlessly motivated manpower pool is fantasy. Post-war exhaustion is real. Emigration is real. War trauma is real. And once martial law is lifted, there is a serious question of how many young men return or leave. Here, the armed non-alignment model gets specific. Ukraine's best defense is territorial denial. Mines, anti-tank systems, cheap attritable drones, short-range artillery, ammunition stockpiles, trenches, fortifications, construction equipment, and layered air defense. It does not require a massive tank-heavy offensive army. It does not require endless prestige platforms. It requires resilience, depth, and the ability to hold at risk an aggressor's objectives through attrition. It also relies on a basic force sizing concept. An attacker traditionally benefits from a rough 3-to-1 advantage. If Russia could surge, say, 500,000 in an offensive push, then a Ukrainian force on the order of to 170,000, 250,000 active combat power with a substantial reserve could, in theory, make the invasion too costly, too slow, too uncertain. That force does not pose an offensive threat to Russia itself, but it can make conquest brutally unattractive. In practical terms, a posture around to 235,000 active and a large reserve component is near the upper edge of what Ukraine can sustain fiscally and demographically. That's crucial. You don't even need an explicit cap if the country can't maintain more than that anyway. A peacetime Ukraine simply cannot field an 800,000 plus force and remain a functioning state, not without collapsing the civilian economy. Capabilities matter as much as troop numbers. Long-range strikes are often fetishized, but their benefits are routinely overstated. Russia has had long-range missile superiority for most of the war. Has that alone decided the war? No. Launch platforms can be repositioned. Air defenses adapt. The war's trajectory is driven more by the aggregate system reconnaissance strike complex, drone swarms, artillery sustainment, manpower replacement rates, logistics endurance, than by dramatic deep strikes. Air defense is the hardest area. A robust denial posture requires interceptors and systems that Ukraine cannot fully produce at scale quickly. This is where Western assistance remains necessary, not as boots-on-the-ground guarantees, but as supply and production integration. Artillery, ammunition, rockets, air defenses, interceptors. Over 5 years, the cost estimates in the model land in the tens of billions, far lower than the indefinite blank check fantasies, but still substantial. And now, we reach the question that many people tiptoe around. Is Russia actually willing to negotiate a real compromise? Or is it engaging in poison pill diplomacy designed to split the United States from Europe, drain Washington's patience, and force an American pullback that leaves Ukraine and the EU exposed? I lean toward the poison pill interpretation, and not because of slogans, because of incentives. Russia has repaired many of its early war deficiencies: command competence, drone warfare integration, manufacturing capacity, recruitment pipelines. Historically, Russia absorbs initial failures and recovers. That pattern is visible across major conflicts. Economically, Moscow has deepened relations with China and India, softening the impact of sanctions pressure, and Western leaders themselves now talk out of both sides of their mouth. Russia was supposedly a gas station with nukes, allegedly scavenging chips from washing machines, but now it is simultaneously portrayed as a juggernaut poised to conquer Europe. Again, which is it? So here is the clean diagnostic question that cuts through propaganda. If you were a commander, would you rather fight Russia in 2022 or Russia in 2025? And would you rather fight Ukraine in 2022 or Ukraine in 2025? My answer is straightforward. Russia was weaker earlier, Ukraine was stronger earlier. Over time, Russia adapted. Ukraine absorbed attrition and faces deeper structural constraints. That does not mean Ukraine is collapsing tomorrow. It means the trend line matters. And in war, trend lines are destiny. This also reframes NATO's situation. Yes, NATO has more members now, but more members does not automatically equal more power, especially if the anchor of the alliance, U.S., political will and U.S. firepower becomes uncertain. The loudest European voices want to speak as if U.S. intervention is guaranteed. It's not. In a direct NATO-Russia escalation scenario, assuming automatic American commitment at full scale is a dangerous gamble. Institutions can look large on paper and still be brittle in crisis, which is precisely why Russia has incentive to keep pressure on, because the greatest strategic prize is not one district in Donbass. The prize is accelerating fractures in Western cohesion, exposing the weakness of European institutions, and tightening the Russia-China alignment in a world where the U.S. is increasingly internally divided. From Moscow's viewpoint, that is a victory of historic scale. So armed non-alignment may be the most technically feasible settlement architecture, but it runs into political and psychological barriers that are not technical. Europe's ego, Kiev's legitimacy, Moscow's suspicion that the West will cheat, and above all, Russia's calculation that time may be on its side. Non-alignment itself needs to be defined with surgical clarity. It is not neutrality in the strict legal sense. A non-aligned Ukraine could still train with Western partners outside Ukraine, integrate defense industry, and even pursue EU membership, a point Moscow has historically treated differently than NATO membership. Intelligence sharing in peacetime would also have to be constrained toward defensive warning and protection of civilians and infrastructure, not live targeting support for offensive strikes. And critically, some mechanism would need to formalize the non-alignment, constitutional change, treaty architecture, or international codification, because ambiguity is how wars restart. But here is the grim reality. Russia will not have faith that the West will adhere to the letter of any agreement. Moscow will assume that excluded systems will quietly arrive anyway under different labels, different basing cycles, different contractual wrappers. That distrust is not imaginary. It is a predictable outcome of how proxy wars and security commitments have worked in practice. And that's the circle you have to square. Ukraine needs enough to deter. Russia needs enough confidence that Ukraine will not become a NATO launchpad. Europe needs a narrative that doesn't look like surrender. The U.S. needs an off-ramp that doesn't look like abandonment. Everyone wants a settlement that feels like victory. That's not how wars end. Wars end when the shape of reality becomes too heavy to carry. So if you want the honest bottom line, armed non-alignment is not a perfect solution. It is a feasible one. It is the first framework in a long time that tries to integrate battlefield realities, force sustainability, and the security concerns of both sides into something implementable rather than rhetorical. But whether it happens depends less on spreadsheets and force tables than on whether the political class in Kiev, in Brussels, in Washington is willing to admit what the map is already saying. And if Russia believes there is blood in the water militarily, economically, and institutionally, then Moscow's incentive is not to compromise early. The incentive is to keep grinding until the compromise becomes harsher, until the alliance cohesion frays further, until the West is negotiating with less leverage than it had before. That is why the peace proposal industry keeps failing. Not because nobody can write a 10-point plan, but because plans that don't match incentives are just paper.